When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I remember standing there in the kitchen, the faint smell of the dinner she had prepared still in the air, and feeling a strange emptiness inside. It wasn't the first time I had felt unwelcome, but something about the calm way she said it made my heart sink. "Maybe it's better if you just go for a while," she said softly, almost as if she were giving me advice rather than delivering a blow. I nodded, smiled, and walked to the door, holding my tears back. I had raised my son with so much care. I stayed up at night when he was sick, washed his school uniforms until my hands ached, and listened to every worry he had, even the ones I didn't understand. I thought those years would make me irreplaceable. But life has a way of showing you that love isn't always enough. I remember sitting in my quiet living room after that day, staring at the walls that had held so many memories of laughter and small joys, and feeling a deep, heavy sadness. I wasn't angry, not really. Just empty. I kept thinking, how did we get here? How did my own son allow someone else to push me out? I want to tell you about my family before this all began, because it wasn't always like this. My son, Daniel, was the light of my life. Even as a boy, he had a gentle heart, always helping others, always thinking about people before himself. I remember when he was 10, he gave his lunch to a stray dog he found near school. He came home hungry but smiling, proud that he had shared what he had. That kind of kindness stayed with him into adulthood. We were a small family. Just Daniel and me, after his father passed away when Daniel was 12. Those years were hard. I had to work double shifts to keep us afloat, but I never let Daniel feel the weight of it. I made sure he had his favorite meals, a warm home, and someone who always believed in him. We became very close, perhaps too close. I was his mother, his confidant, and his support system through every little failure and heartbreak. When Daniel started dating Lily, I was happy. I wanted him to be happy. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed kind. I admit I let my heart believe she was perfect for him. At first, everything was simple. They laughed together, cooked together, and I thought, maybe life had given me a little extra joy. For a while, I tried to welcome her into our home, to make her feel included. I baked cookies, offered advice when asked, and smiled at every small sign of affection between them. But slowly, the warmth faded. I didn't notice it at first, because I thought small disagreements were normal. I thought, they're young. They'll work it out. But over time, I started noticing how she looked at me when I entered a room, not the polite smile of a guest, but a glance that felt measured, almost calculating. It began with small things. She would move my son's clothes without telling me, change his routines, or suggest I shouldn't interfere with their plans. She would say things like, "Mom, Daniel and I have this handled," with a tone that made me feel like an intruder. I wanted to be patient. I wanted to give her space. I told myself she had just moved into our family, and it takes time to adjust. But I felt the distance growing, like a shadow creeping across the warmth I had built with Daniel over the years. The house felt quieter. Conversations became shorter. My son, who used to run to me with stories about his day, started leaving the room when I entered, distracted by his phone or Lily's voice. I tried to talk to him, gently. "Daniel, are you okay? Is something wrong?" But he would just nod and smile, and I knew he was hiding something. I remember the day I first felt truly excluded. It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were supposed to have lunch together. I was making his favorite chicken soup, simmering it slowly on the stove while humming a song from his childhood. When I called him to the table, he was gone. Lily had taken him out, without a word. That evening, she told me, "Daniel and I needed some time alone. Maybe you should rest." She smiled politely, but I could feel the finality in her words. "Time alone," she said. "Without you." That day, I sat by the window, looking at the empty street, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I didn't cry. I just breathed, trying to convince myself that this was a phase, that Daniel would come back to me, and that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't trying to hurt me. But the thought lingered, stubborn and heavy, I might be losing him. I share this because I know many of you have felt this kind of quiet heartbreak, where someone you love slowly drifts away, not with a dramatic fight, but with soft words, polite gestures, and silent exclusions. It's harder to fight when the change is subtle. When the people you care about start listening to someone else more than you, you feel small, invisible, almost irrelevant. And yet, I kept my calm. I smiled when Lily greeted me at the door. I tried to make jokes during dinner. I pretended everything was normal, because losing Daniel completely scared me more than anything else. I couldn't face the thought that the years of love, care, and sacrifice could be brushed aside by someone else's influence. After that first Sunday, the distance between us only grew. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no arguments, no shouting matches. Just a quiet shift, a slow pulling away that I could feel in my chest every time I walked into the house. I started noticing the small things that once went unnoticed. My son no longer asked for my advice. He stopped sharing the little moments of his day. He barely laughed at my attempts to make him smile. And Lily, always there, always close, seemed to occupy a space I had once held so naturally. I tried to hold on to my patience. I told myself I had to be understanding, that maybe it was the normal adjustment of a new marriage. But patience doesn't stop the ache of absence. I would make a cup of tea and sit alone in the living room, listening to the silence. I would replay memories in my mind, Daniel as a boy, running into my arms after school, telling me about his dreams. Those memories felt like fragile glass, and I was afraid to touch them too closely, afraid they might shatter under the weight of reality. Visits became tense. I would come over to help, to be part of family meals, and yet I could feel myself being measured, observed. Every gesture, every word seemed under scrutiny. I stopped offering to cook, to clean, to do the small things I had always done. It felt as though everything I did was no longer appreciated, no longer welcome. I began to shrink inside, careful not to take up space that wasn't mine anymore. I remember one afternoon vividly. The sun was warm on the porch, and I sat there, rocking slowly in my chair. My heart felt heavy, and my hands were clasped in my lap. I realized then that I wasn't just feeling ignored, I was slowly losing the person I loved most. It wasn't her actions alone that hurt, but the way my son allowed them to separate us. He didn't see it, or perhaps he chose not to see it. And so the silence grew louder than any words could. I tried to find explanations. I told myself that Lily wanted the best for him, that she was protecting their marriage, that she didn't understand the depth of our bond. I tried to convince myself that my role as his mother didn't need to compete with his role as a husband. I told myself many things to make the loneliness bearable. But deep down, I knew the truth. Slowly, imperceptibly, my son was choosing her over me. The holidays became the hardest. Where once our home had been full of laughter, now there were only polite exchanges, brief smiles, and careful gestures. I watched as Lily rearranged traditions I had built over decades. The family table, once full of stories, jokes, and small celebrations, felt sterile. I would sit quietly, listening to conversations that no longer included me. I tried to speak up, to join in, but my words often went unnoticed or were brushed aside. There was a moment that stands out in particular. We were preparing for a small family dinner. I had spent the morning cleaning, making sure everything was perfect. I had baked his favorite cake, carefully iced with a heart on top. But when the time came, I watched as Lily directed everything, instructing my son, arranging the plates, moving decorations. I felt invisible. I felt like a visitor in my own home. And yet, I smiled and nodded, hiding the growing ache inside me. Every week brought more signs. I noticed little changes in my son's behavior, subtle at first but undeniable over time. He no longer called me spontaneously. He no longer came into the kitchen to ask about my day. He didn't invite me into their life. And Lily, always present, always guiding, always influencing, made sure our closeness was pushed further and further away. I began to realize that I couldn't force love or attention. I couldn't make my son see what I saw, feel what I felt. All I could do was witness the slow drift, the quiet erosion of the bond one had nurtured for years. And that was one of the most painful lessons I have ever learned. Love, no matter how deep, cannot always prevent distance. I tried to stay involved in small ways. I sent notes, called occasionally, offered help when asked. But the warmth was gone. It was replaced with polite smiles and careful gestures. I felt like a shadow, always present but never truly seen. I realized then that the love I had given freely for so long was now a fragile thread, and I had to decide how to hold onto it without breaking myself completely. I spent many nights sitting quietly in my living room, reflecting on the years that had brought us here. I thought about all the times I had sacrificed, all the nights I had stayed awake worrying, all the moments of joy and pride I had felt watching my son grow. And now, in this quiet, I faced the reality that those memories were mine alone. My son was moving forward, building a life that didn't include me the way it once had. The sadness wasn't sharp or explosive. It was a constant hum in my chest, a low ache that accompanied every thought, every step. I didn't cry often. I didn't scream. I simply acknowledged the truth and tried to breathe through it. I tried to remind myself that love isn't always about presence or closeness. Sometimes it's about wishing happiness for someone, even when it means letting them go. As time passed, I began noticing other changes as well. Lily would subtly question my intentions, suggesting I was overstepping or misreading situations. She framed my concern as interference, my care as something I needed to hold back. It wasn't overt hostility, just a quiet redirection of my son's attention, a gentle steering away from me. And my son, caught between loyalty to me and loyalty to her, didn't always defend me. That realization cut deeper than any words could. It became clear that I couldn't rely on my son to protect our bond. I had to protect it myself, in whatever way I could. And that meant learning to sit with the pain, to accept the distance, and to find strength in quiet observation. I watched, I waited, I loved from afar, all the while trying not to let bitterness take root. And so the days passed, slowly, quietly. I went about my routines, tended my home, and tried to fill the spaces of my heart with memories that reminded me of why I loved him so fiercely. Each visit, each interaction, was a test of patience, a lesson in acceptance. And each day, I felt the weight of our separation more keenly, even as I told myself I had to endure it with grace. The turning point didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, like a shadow stretching across a room, unnoticed at first, and then impossible to ignore. It came in moments I had begun to dread but tried to convince myself were harmless. It started with small shifts in my son's behavior that I could no longer explain away. He would cancel visits at the last minute, often with vague excuses, and the apologies felt hollow. Sometimes he would spend hours on the phone, murmuring quietly, glancing toward me with a distracted smile, and then retreat into his bedroom. The closeness we once shared, the laughter, the small jokes, the shared memories, was slowly dissolving. And Lily's presence always seemed to grow stronger, more protective, more insistent. I tried to remind myself that this was all part of marriage. That couples need their own space. But deep inside, a knot had formed in my stomach that I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just absence. It was exclusion. And I realized one day that it was deliberate. The moment I can never forget came on a quiet evening. I had prepared a simple dinner, hoping we could spend time together, just the three of us. I set the table, lit a candle, and smiled as I heard the front door open. My son walked in, tired from work, and I greeted him warmly, the way I always did. But Lily was there before I could speak, and the shift in the air was immediate. She moved through the house with a calm efficiency that made me feel like I was in someone else's home. She spoke to my son with a tenderness I recognized but that was reserved for me before. And then, softly, almost casually, she said the words that broke something inside me, "Mom, maybe it's better if you don't stay for dinner tonight." I froze. The knife I had been holding hovered over the cutting board. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I simply nodded and placed the plate back in the sink. I smiled, the same smile I had practiced for months, the one that hid the ache in my chest. I left the house quietly, walking down the street with my head down, listening to the faint hum of evening traffic. I felt like I had been erased from the life I had spent decades building. On the walk home, I replayed every memory of raising my son. I remembered the nights I had stayed awake when he was sick, the lunches I had packed with care, the long conversations that stretched into the early hours. I thought about every time I had been there, every moment I had sacrificed, every tear I had wiped from his cheek. And now, in that quiet, I realized it had not been enough. Not enough to keep me in his life in the way I once was. The days after that night were the hardest. I began noticing a pattern I had refused to see before. Lily's influence was subtle but relentless. She spoke to my son about me in ways I could only imagine, shaping his perceptions, guiding his emotions. I started to see how she had carefully inserted herself into every decision, every interaction, every moment we might have shared. And my son, unwilling or unable to resist, allowed it. He chose her, and I was left standing at the edge of our life together, watching the bond one had nurtured slowly dissolve. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, sunlight streaming through the window, and thinking about the person I had become. I was quiet, cautious, careful not to do anything that might upset the fragile balance. I realized then that I had stopped being a mother in the way I once was. I was no longer an active part of my son's daily life. I was merely a spectator, watching from a distance as my own child built a world where I had no place. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the quiet, deliberate erasure of my presence. It was the way my son stopped calling, stopped asking, stopped sharing. It was the way she subtly turned him away, and the way he accepted it without protest. That is what hurt the most, the acceptance. The willingness to let me fade from our shared life. I tried to speak with him about it, to reach him with gentle words, but it was always met with vague reassurances, distracted smiles, and promises to do better. Nothing changed. And slowly, I began to understand that this was not about anger or disagreement. It was about control, influence, and choices. My son had made a choice, and it was clear who he had chosen. There were nights I lay awake thinking about all the years I had invested in him. I thought about how I had tried to be patient, how I had tried to give him freedom, how I had tried to accept Lily as part of our lives. I thought about the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the joy, the pride. And yet, none of it could prevent the slow unraveling of our bond. I felt a grief that was quiet but relentless, like a river cutting through stone over time. I realized then that I could no longer wait for him to come back. I could no longer hope that he would see the truth, that he would recognize the love that had always been there. The turning point was not a single moment, but a realization. I could not force him to keep me in his life. I could not control the choices he made. I could only control how I responded. That realization brought a strange mix of sorrow and clarity. The sorrow came from the knowledge that I was losing my son, piece by piece, to a life that no longer had room for me. The clarity came from the understanding that I had to protect my own heart. I had to find a way to live with the absence without letting it destroy me. And so I began to step back, not with anger, not with resentment, but with quiet acceptance. I allowed myself to grieve the loss of the closeness we once shared. I allowed myself to feel the emptiness, the sadness, the quiet ache that had been growing inside me for months. But I also began to realize that love does not always mean presence. Sometimes love is simply wishing someone well, even when you are no longer part of their daily life. The turning point was complete when I stopped waiting for my son to choose me, when I stopped hoping for moments that would never come. I let go of the idea that my role in his life could be restored to what it once was. And in that letting go, I found a strange sense of peace, a quiet strength that I had not known I possessed. I still loved him. That never changed. But I learned to love from a distance, to cherish the memories, and to hold on to the hope that one day, in some small way, he might recognize the bond we once shared. And even if he didn't, I would carry that love within me, as a source of comfort and resilience, rather than a source of pain. It was a slow, painful lesson in acceptance. But it was necessary. The turning point was not a dramatic confrontation or a single betrayal. It was the quiet realization that my son's choices were no longer mine to guide, that his life was moving forward without me in the center, and that I had to find a way to survive emotionally while still loving him deeply. The days, weeks, and months that followed the turning point were not easy. The quiet absence of my son's presence was something I had to learn to live with. There were mornings when I would wake up and instinctively reach for him, only to remember that he was no longer a part of my everyday life in the same way. It was a strange, hollow feeling, like a room missing its central light. But I knew that sorrow was not the end. It was only the beginning of a different kind of love, one that required patience, understanding, and quiet strength. I began to change the way I approached our interactions. I no longer tried to insert myself into his life or to fix the gaps between us. I stopped sending messages expecting immediate responses, and I stopped planning visits with the hope of being welcomed. Instead, I began to focus on the moments when he did reach out, small as they were, and I accepted them without judgment or expectation. Every text, every brief phone call, every occasional visit became precious. I began to see that love could exist even in a smaller, quieter form. I also started to reflect deeply on my own feelings. I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the loss of closeness with my son, but for the innocence of the relationship as it once had been. I remembered the nights I had stayed up rocking him when he was sick, the days I had spent making sure he had everything he needed, the laughter we had shared over small, silly moments. Those memories became a source of comfort rather than sorrow. They reminded me that the love I had given was never wasted, even if the bond had changed. In this process, I found the beginning of forgiveness. Not the kind that requires forgetting or excusing hurtful behavior, but the kind that allows me to release the weight of anger and bitterness. I forgave Lily, not for her sake, but for mine. I forgave her for taking the place I had once occupied in my son's life. I forgave my son, too, not because he had done anything wrong intentionally, but because holding on to resentment would only hurt me. Forgiveness, I realized, was a way of reclaiming peace within myself. I also discovered small ways to remain connected to my son without interfering. I would send letters sometimes, not demanding replies, just sharing thoughts or memories. I would call occasionally, briefly, and listen more than I spoke. When he responded, even with a short message, I received it with gratitude rather than expectation. These small acts became a bridge, fragile but alive, keeping some thread of our relationship intact. It was different from before, yes, but it was still connection. And connection, however quiet, was enough to remind me that love does not vanish simply because circumstances change. I spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to let go. I realized that letting go does not mean giving up on someone. It does not mean cutting them out of your life entirely. It means accepting that you cannot control their choices, that you cannot force them to see things your way, and that their happiness may look different from what you once imagined. Letting go is about finding peace in the space between love and absence, about cherishing what remains instead of mourning what is lost. There were days of loneliness, certainly. The quiet ache would return, especially in the evenings when the house was still and memories crowded in. I would remember his laughter, the way he used to come running into my arms, the small habits that had once made our life together simple and joyful. And sometimes tears would come, not out of anger, but out of a deep, human longing for the closeness that was no longer the same. Yet even in those moments, I felt the seeds of resilience taking root. I discovered parts of myself that had been overshadowed by the intensity of caring for my son. I revisited old hobbies, spent more time with friends, and learned to enjoy the quiet spaces in my life. Slowly, I began to feel whole again, even as my son's life moved forward in ways that no longer included me fully. And then there were small, unexpected moments of warmth. A message from him that said nothing more than, "Thinking of you." A photo sent quietly, just for me. A brief phone call in the evening, where he laughed at something I said. These moments were fleeting, but they reminded me that the bond we shared had not disappeared entirely. It had simply transformed. I realized that my son's happiness was separate from my own expectations. I could wish for his joy without demanding that it include me in the way I once wanted. I could love him fully while accepting that his life had taken a different path. And in that acceptance, I found the quiet peace I had been seeking. Over time, I also began to let go of the bitterness toward Lily. I understood that she was not an enemy, but a part of my son's life, someone he had chosen to share his world with. I could not control her influence, but I could control my own response. I chose compassion. I chose understanding. I chose to release the weight of resentment and to focus on what remained, the love that was still alive, even if quieter than before. I learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a process. It grows slowly, like a river carving its way through stone. It takes time, patience, and reflection. It requires seeing the humanity in others, even when they have hurt you, and recognizing that holding on to pain only prolongs suffering. And as I forgave, I felt a lightness return to my heart, a gentle warmth that reminded me of the love I had given and still carried within me. In this period of resolution, I also discovered the importance of boundaries. I could love my son without sacrificing my own well-being. I could care for him without being consumed by the distance between us. I could remain in his life, however subtly, without losing myself in the process. And that was a lesson I had not understood fully until the quiet aftermath of our drift revealed it. I came to see that love is not always loud. It does not always demand attention or recognition. Sometimes, love is quiet, patient, and enduring. It is the act of wishing someone well, of holding memories close, of remaining present even from a distance. And in that quiet love, I found my strength, my peace, and my ability to continue caring without losing myself entirely. The resolution did not erase the pain. It did not restore our relationship to what it once was. But it offered a way forward. It allowed me to breathe without the constant ache of longing. It allowed me to see my son's life with clarity, and to accept it without bitterness. And it allowed me to love him in a way that was sustainable, tender, and enduring. I came to understand that life sometimes asks us to hold love differently than we imagined. Sometimes the heart must stretch and adapt, learning to exist in spaces that are smaller, quieter, and less visible. And even in those spaces, love can thrive, offering comfort, resilience, and hope for the future. Looking back now, I realize that life did not unfold the way I had imagined, and that's okay. I once thought that my love, my care, and my years of dedication would guarantee my place at the center of my son's life forever. I thought that a bond built over decades could not be broken. But life has a way of teaching us humility, patience, and acceptance. My son's choices reminded me that love is not possession, it is trust, it is letting go, and it is wishing happiness even when it is not fully shared. The quiet spaces that once made me ache now feel gentle, almost comforting. I have learned to fill them with reflection, gratitude, and small joys. I cherish the memories of raising my son, the quiet moments of laughter, the bedtime stories, the shared meals, and the long talks that stretched into the night. Those moments belong to me, and no one can take them away. They are a testament to a love that was deep, real, and enduring. I have also learned the subtle strength of patience. Love does not always demand attention or recognition. Sometimes it asks us to step back, to breathe, and to allow life to take its course. I have learned that being present does not always mean being seen. Sometimes it means existing quietly, loving silently, and trusting that bonds of the heart cannot be erased, even when they change shape. Forgiveness has been a quiet companion in my journey. I have forgiven my son for the ways he allowed distance to grow, and I have forgiven my daughter-in-law for the choices that altered our closeness. Forgiveness does not erase the pain, but it lifts the weight from my shoulders. It has allowed me to see the situation with clarity and compassion, rather than anger or regret. And in doing so, it has restored a kind of peace that I did not think possible during those lonely months. I have learned to love differently. I no longer cling to the vision of what our relationship once was. I no longer demand the constant closeness I once expected. Instead, I love from a place of quiet understanding. I celebrate small gestures, small moments, and the knowledge that our bond, though changed, still exists. I have discovered that love is resilient, it can survive absence, distance, and even subtle betrayal, if it is nurtured with patience and kindness. And I have found hope. Hope that my son will always carry a part of my love with him, even if it is not visible in every interaction. Hope that he will someday understand the depth of what I gave. Hope that life will continue to teach him the value of patience, respect, and gratitude, the lessons I tried to teach him through years of care and guidance. Most importantly, I have learned to treasure myself in the process. I have discovered that I am more than the role I played in my son's life. I am a person with my own joys, my own strength, and my own peace. I have learned to nurture myself, to embrace the quiet moments, and to carry forward the love I feel without letting it consume me. Life has a way of reshaping us. It asks us to bend without breaking, to endure without losing heart, and to love without expectation. And through this journey, I have found that even when life does not give us what we hoped for, it can still offer us grace, understanding, and quiet joy. As I sit now, reflecting on the years, I feel a gentle warmth in my heart. I am at peace with the changes, with the losses, and with the new way of loving. I have discovered that the deepest kind of love is not always the loudest or the most visible. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and enduring, a love that survives absence, forgives gently, and holds hope even in the softest spaces of the heart. And that is the lesson I want to leave behind: love deeply, forgive freely, and accept that life does not always follow the path we imagine. But even when it does not, love can endure, transform, and guide us toward a gentle peace we never thought possible.